Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here, and I'm going to do something a little different and a little familiar at the same time. Well, one, this isn't a review or critique of this specific sword in the sense that it's a one-of-a-kind custom piece, and I don't know that you can necessarily get one, and it's been used and abused and loved and liked, and it's no longer perhaps representative of what you'd expect to get if you were to buy one new. But I will put in the description down below who made it. If you're interested in getting one, you can reach out to them. I do want to note the familiarity here, though I will be pushing this to failure, beating the snot out of it, and attempting to break it. Now, this is a blade made out of CPM 3V, which is supposed to be an exotic super steel, and I haven't ever gotten a chance to really play with any swords, at least not abuse them to the point of failure made out of this material. So we'll see, or I'll get to see if it deserves its kind of lauded reputation. I do want to give a special thanks to sword friend Matt, who sent this to me. Being a one-of-a-kind custom piece made of 3V means that it's probably not an inexpensive thing, and I have no idea how much it is. I didn't ask. I just said, yes, I will try to break it. But I'm guessing it's not a cheap thing. Even with the damage that you see, a one-of-a-kind custom-made 3V blade is generally not an inexpensive thing. So I appreciate him sending it my way for posterity's sake. A couple critiques a little bit about the blade. As far as I do know about this particular project, it was a design made from somebody on the forums in a kind of a fantasy-esque thing. It's not a historical blade. It's not intended to be. And when I saw pictures of it, initially I was less excited than I am now. And while I'm interested in breaking a 3V blade, I did think that this was going to be a chunky monkey to move around. And it is stout. It has an imposing feel. It's tip heavy. It's a chopper, clearly. However, it's not dumb feeling in the hand. There's an elegance to it. There's some components that I don't like from a design perspective, but in terms of execution, I think for what it is, it's actually more comfortable than I expected and cooler looking. And there's certainly some craftsmanship here that I appreciate. The scales, how they're lined out, all seems to work and fit really well. Handle-wise, if I can complain about a few things, and I'm not trying to throw shade at anyone who made it. This is likely per design. But if I hold it here and twist, it's a little bit more round than it is ovoid, and it doesn't lock into my hands, even if I kind of hold on one of these middle sections here. So how that pans out when I go to actually smash things, kind of expecting it to turn a little bit in my hand. We'll see how that happens, though. This ring pommel, probably my biggest complaint, in that I tend to hold something high, choke up almost on the guard area, and then hold low. And this little swoop down here is a natural place for my pinky to rest, but this spur at the bottom is just jamming into the fat of my hand. And if I impact anything with it, I mean, it's kind of painful to move, but I'm going to be bleeding pretty quick if I actually hit stuff with it. So sword friend Matt did give me the okay to sand this down, but I might just put on some sort of thick glove or something, because I kind of want to try it in the design that it is. There's a little kind of cutout in here too that almost looks like it'd be for a finger. It's just not big enough to do anything with. So I'm not sure what, if I can't get a finger over here, why have this here? But I digress. Rest of the bit, there are some notes that I can put in the grind lines here. They do waver a little bit kind of in this area, and I don't know if that's from later usage or not, but I would speculate that it's not. There's a little bit of waver, though, really very, very minor. The lines are overall smooth, though, which is nice to see. They don't see a lot of rippling, especially in the fuller area, which is probably the most impressive. Usually when I see these fullers, I'm guessing, given how uniform it is, that it was ground out, and it's really steady. There's not rippling in the fuller area, which is very surprising. Even in custom pieces, I tend to see that pretty frequently. The bevels are also symmetrical. Having recently reviewed a different, very expensive custom knife made out of 3V, which I didn't get to push to failure, this has cleaner grind lines. They go off in the same direction. They're the same size, and that's refreshing to see. Now, obviously, the sword has been sharpened. Well, I don't know how obvious it is to you. My camera work might not be up to snuff, but to me, I can clearly see that it has been sharpened, and there's been some damage to the blade. It's been chipped a little bit up here, and a chunk was taken out here, and now it's been reprofiled and sharpened. So I'm guessing that the bevel kind of flew a little bit more naturally. Anyway, despite that it's diminished, it could be profiled in such a way to be keened up. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen here. My speculation is, and I'm going to go out and abuse it, I'm going to swing it at logs and get progressively harder, take it to the croquet stick of doom, see what happens. I'll show you cross sections when I get to it, but I'm thinking that it's probably going to chip in the croquet stick of doom. 3V is very hard stuff, and it's not as shock resistant as I understand some of the other steels that I might have are, but I don't really know. That's just what I've seen from charts, and I don't make them, so there's a lot of context and science there that I'm not up to snuff on. So I am, from, as I understand the steel to act, expecting things to chip. We'll see if that happens. And I'd speculate at one of these teeth here is probably where, if it is going to break, if I can get it to break, where it will do so. It's not, I mean, this might look thin. It's not really particularly thin, but I'll put measurements and weight and all that kind of stuff in the description down below if you're keen on that kind of stuff. Final, thoughts just about the general design is I really, this looks like a fantasy-inspired piece. Those generally aren't my thing. I enjoy them. I enjoy anything sharp and shiny. I'm kind of tickled by how it feels, honestly. This feels very competent in the hand. It has some design characteristics that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of, but the way it feels in the hand, the way I feel like I could move it, a little bit of sanding on this spur area here, maybe a little widening here, and I would have something that I would feel actually pretty comfortable with. Different design aesthetic, but the execution here and the way it feels, I'm very pleased with. I wasn't expecting it either, and that was kind of the treat. Is when I took this thing out of the box and held it, I was like, oh well hey, okay. It's always fun when you get those expectations, when something exceeds your expectations in that way. It's one of those fun things, not like when you reach in the refrigerator to like get orange juice and accidentally grab milk and it throws you off. And not that you don't enjoy milk, but when you're expecting orange juice or vice versa, it's always a pleasant surprise when you're expecting something to feel clubbish and brutish and dumb. And it has kind of a sense of refinement that you totally didn't expect. So anyway, that's this. I do enjoy it. The theme and everything as well is imposing and scary, but design elements aside, I'm just, the execution on the way it actually feels is pretty fun. I'm looking forward to swinging it around. Anyway, I'm going to shut up and actually get on with swinging it around. All right, sword friends, I began the cutting with a pool noodle, which isn't a challenging target, but it does give me a feel for the sword, moving it around, as well as how sharp the sword is. Now, if a blade is dull, it bats the pool noodle around pretty much regardless of what you do. And if it's obscenely sharp, then it kind of pops the pool noodle apart, even if you're a little so-so on your edge alignment. This is somewhere in between. It's really quite sharp, but at the same time, not so sharp that it just pops the pool noodle apart. With good edge alignment, I can move through it even towards the tip, and so it's got a nice keen edge on it. After cutting the pool noodle a bit, I cut into a paper target, which is something analogous to a tatami mat. It's a little bit denser, but I'm making some experiments trying to replace tatami since it's costly and hard to come by at the moment. I brought out a katana as well, doing some cuts just to compare and contrast, something that I'm a little bit more familiar with. Also a sword that I'm testing. You'll see that in a future review. And the sword cuts fine. This one cuts pretty well. The katana cut through it. When I brought out a bigger target with some more, call it cardboard, in it as well, this sword could handle things that the katana simply couldn't, especially if I really wound up. I could move through this really big, wide, almost 7-inch diameter piece of wrapped paper. What I also noticed on this was something maybe a little bit interesting, and that is that the teeth on it would bite in and kind of drag back. I could almost feel some drag as I was moving through the larger targets that would pull a little bit. It's not something that really impacts the cut, but perceptible, and it was something different, not something I've had in a cut before. So anyway, it moved well, the edge held up well, there was no bending and any issues like that, and that's what you'd expect in a sword in general. So you would hope that it wouldn't bend, that it wouldn't have issues. But this 3V blade is really something special, so I move on to pretty much more abusive territory right away. I'm cutting a log, and it's worth noting, I should say, that this log has broken other swords before. I've struck the same material into other blades, and it's caused it to break. Very often obtuse edge angles will pretty much bounce off, and this, despite having a more obtuse edge angle, it bites in right away. I can cut against the grain, and it just chops right in. It buries itself pretty deep in the material, and it's hard to dislodge. I made several strikes into the log, and eventually I was able to cut through it. It didn't matter that it had knots. I stuck it in and batoned it. It didn't penetrate much deeper when I was batoning, but the teeth didn't break off on the sawtooth on the back, and it held up overall really, really well. It's also worth noting here that a bend would be acceptable. Basically, wood is a debatable target on abuse. Some people say it's not abusive, and tests historically were done on wood, and other people say, well, it is abusive, there will be some cost to doing that. And I would argue that the sword should not break. It should not argue. I don't think it should snap in half, or there should be really anything that impedes it from being a weapon, from cutting into wood the way I'm doing it here. But rattles developing in the hilt, dulling along the edge, losing that really refined, sharpened edge would be acceptable. Sometimes twists or bends happen to a minor degree, and all of those I would say are acceptable and things that you should expect to have to deal with after cutting wood potentially. None of those were problems in this case. I was really actually impressed with edge retention. It seemed to retain the same edge that it had going into it, which I thought was pretty cool. So from there, I opted to throw it after having batoned it into wood. And it, again, held up. There was no bending, no twisting, no anything as a result of throwing it in, with the exception of one of the throws that I made went into a rock and into the dirt and into kind of a stony area. And it had some edge damage from doing that, which is not great, but I guess is expected from throwing a sword, which is on the tippier, heavier side into a rock. That seems to be okay. Otherwise, the tree is braced. It doesn't move so much. The sword then absorbs all the shock and momentum that it has, and it's rattled off scales. It's caused tips to bend. It's caused dulling, chipping, and the like on other swords in the past. So good that it didn't happen here. It held up really well. And overall, I would say that is the typical use and abusive section that debatably is expected with most swords, and it passed all that with flying colors. Edge retention was great. It didn't bend, flex, do anything. None of the handle scales popped off. It seemed pretty well built. Other notes that I would have in there is that I expected the handle to move and rotate in my hand. It did that a little bit, honestly. It did rotate. Some of these little pieces on here gave me some more purchase on the grip, and I was holding it in two hands pretty tight when I was striking in. It didn't roll as much as I expected, but on some of the logs it did twist a little bit in my hand, so it is something that did happen. If it were a little bit more elliptical, then that would be great, but I didn't find it to be terribly problematic, at least in practice. From there, I opted to do one more abusive thing, which was bending, before I moved on to kind of metal work, if you will. And that was, I struck the sword against the flat of my stand. And typically, a sword will bend. All but the best through hardened blades tend to bend when I do this. So differentially hardened blades, kind of par for the course that they will bend. But through hardened blades typically will bend when I do this, unless it's some of the best heat treatments out there. So it's pretty rare that I can slap it on the side of my stand intentionally and get it not to bend. And this was kind of an exception. The blade itself did not bend whatsoever. It remained perfectly straight. I didn't see any twists, any bends, any issues whatsoever. But at the junction where it meets the hilt area here, that's where it would kind of cant off one direction or another. So I could notice it. It was perceptible. It did bend, and I could smack it on the other side, and it would bend back. And as I did it more, it got a little bit easier. Perhaps there's some fatiguing taking place, and I don't know if the tang is hardened the same way as the blade. It would be commonplace for that not necessarily to be the case, but that's where it would take a bend. So it could, but not in the blade area itself, which was good. And as far as I know, 3V is supposed to have good edge retention, and it's supposed to be pretty high in toughness, so it seems to bear out. Some 1060 blades haven't bent when I've done this. Some other through hardened blades haven't, but there's been many steels as well that have taken bends and sets when I've slapped them into the side of the stand. I brought it to the tree as well and flexed it. Same result kind of happened there. The scales started to pop off a little bit near the hilt area. And so it can take a bend, but I wouldn't say it was terrible. And it was at such an angle that, again, some blades will bend off at a 45-degree angle when I do this. Others will bend off more, so you don't have a lot of tip presence. This bent off minor enough where I felt like I could still make thrusts and cuts meaningfully. It didn't deter it from being a weapon. I mean, it did a little bit, but not substantially. Not so much that it wasn't still useful in the task of whacking people with. Anyway, from there, I moved on to more abusive stuff. I cut a can, and the can is a metal can just filled with water. This took the same damage as really any other sword, honestly. It's maybe a little bit less. I typically cut with katanas. They tend to have a finer edge on them, or at least not as reinforced, not as obtuse an angle. And in this case, it scratched the surface of the steel, and it diminished the edge where it impacted the can, which is what I typically see in a lot of other swords. I'd hoped that wouldn't happen, but it did here, and it acted mostly like any other sword with a more obtuse edge angle. It's not bad. It just doesn't wow me from the standpoint that other swords have done the same thing, and they're not they don't have the same magical property. So I was kind of hoping that it wouldn't take surface scratches, and that it also would not have the same kind of edge glinting, defecting, minor chipping area where the edge is impacted. Anyway, it did. I moved on to more abusive stuff. Now, in retrospect, I do sincerely wish that I hadn't done this and that I had brought it to the brass piece, or that I had tried to do some other abusive stuff. But I went right to the croquet stake of doom. Maybe it was because it was windy, or maybe it's because I'm lazy. Regardless, I went from cutting the metal can and tossing the sword to the croquet stake of doom. So there wasn't a lot of in between. And the first strike on the croquet stake of doom landed a pretty substantial chip in the edge. And in looking at the section that broke off, the grain structure appears really good, at least from what I can tell. It's a nice satin color. There's no large grains. It all appears very, very fine. So it doesn't strike me as a bad heat treatment. And again, it helps substantiate that this is a reasonably well heat treated CPM 3V blade, and that, it's not coarse grain structure, something that appears poorly tempered. Anyway, the first strike, it broke off like 4, maybe 5 millimeters deep into the blade. Subsequent strikes would chip off other areas that are about as deep, but it didn't really go any further back, and it blunted itself, and it was basically then, it broke off 5 inches and didn't retreat any further into the blade. It's not as though I could gradually chip off 5 millimeters each and every strike. It was just that finer edge point that would chip off, and then from there I could strike into the blade, and it would basically just blunt itself and whack the croquet stake of doom around. I turned it around after several strikes and started on the spine. The teeth broke off from the saw area, the sawtooth area, and those are going to be fun to step on later because I have no idea where they are. But they broke off in some area, flew apart, and then eventually the sword broke off. Now, worth noting that it did break off pretty close to where I thought it was. It broke off around the teeth, but I thought it would break off in one of the recesses of the teeth, and it broke off just below where the first tooth would start, the first groove would. And honestly, I kind of like the way this blade now looks. I think it's actually kind of a handsome chopper, and I'm more inclined to maybe round this off and have kind of a cool, nifty little chopper at the end. But anyway, it broke in a similar way to other swords, and that's why I think my intro for this video was probably crap, because this is a very expensive CPM 3V blade. It's a steel that people idolize and laud as like the zombie apocalypse kind of final version super steel, super cool stuff that has the edge retention, spectacular edge retention and spectacular toughness, and is kind of the be-all end-all. Or at least that's in some circles what's said. Not that everyone says that, but that's something that I've heard. So the steel held up well. But I think the way it acted on the croquet stake of doom kind of showcases that it certainly comes with some trade-offs. The edge retention was very good, and it sprung back. It balanced a good balance between the edge retention of a differentially hardened blade and the springiness of a through-hardened blade. And it married those two things pretty well when I was dealing with branches and things like that. But as soon as I went to abusive stuff like metal, which is a mild steel rod, and granted it's abusive, it chipped off like a differentially hardened blade did. It shared that kind of downside to things, and that a pretty good swath of it came off. Likewise, when I flipped it on the spine and struck it on the back, it didn't really hold up better than other steels do in terms of that kind of shock resistance. Some 1060 blades have held up better. The Beiser S7 blade that I tested held up better, and those were probably similar in terms of thickness and not as wide a steel piece. So, and they were in katana. They're different swords. It's not necessarily fair to compare it to, but I would say that I've had other swords that have held up to the croquet stake of doom better. In this case, it broke like many other swords did on the croquet stake of doom, and I wish that didn't happen. I was hoping there was magic in the steel, but in this case, it did not. So one incidental thing that is worth noting is on the croquet stake of doom, I did notice a lot more rotating in my hand. It would glance down and then kind of strike into the stand, so I did feel the rotation a bit more on the croquet stake of doom. Also, it did way more damage to the croquet stake of doom than other swords did, and that's not something I usually notice or harp on or measure, but I saw a lot more material removed, and it looked like the cuts into the croquet stake of doom were deeper than they have been with other pieces. So what that amounts to, I don't know, but it did leave more of a mark on the croquet stake of doom than other swords have. All right, sword friends, that's all of the first-hand experience that I can share with you. The sword is now broken, and I can just do the talky opinion part of this. And since this isn't really a critique of this specific sword, I will say that the construction of it held up really well. It seems to be well heat-treated, and I don't doubt that this is a good representation of 3V. If I'm wrong on that, throw it in the commentary down below. I'd be interested if that's the case. But I do think that this is a good well heat-treated blade and a well-manufactured piece. What does it tell me about 3V, which was really the purpose of this video? And that, to me, is really something that, well, I guess I caught myself in believing a little bit of the magic of 3V, right? So it's typically an expensive steel. I've seen it do some pretty amazing cutting feats, and I've kind of thought of it as the best case scenario for a sword steel, in that it has really great edge retention and it seems to be very durable stuff. And the tests that I did here show me that that's not necessarily the case. This sword is about as thick as many of the katana that I've tested, but obviously quite a bit wider. And it didn't really hold up better. It did some things really well. It had excellent edge retention, as I noted, and it didn't take a bend particularly easy, which is great. It balances the edge retention perhaps of a differentially hardened blade with the resilience of a through hardened blade if you're using some normal targets. And if you were cutting tatami mats or bamboo or things that a sword might actually cut, then it is a great option to do those things, and maybe a leading option in doing those things, because edge retention and resilience are important things. But when you go to the abusive side of things and cut a stupid thing like a metal rod, then it really shows some of those trade-offs, and that it chipped really easy and eventually broke pretty much like everything else does. So I don't think it's the end-all be-all. In the event that you're thinking end-of-days zombie apocalypse scenario, and you might have a zombie in a motorcycle helmet, or you might miss and hit a chain link fence post, this is not going to be the best steel to do those kinds of things. And I've had some other 3V swords in my hands where, you know, they seem to be geared towards that, and it doesn't seem like it's the best option for it. So it was, it was very interesting to me to learn that kind of thing, because I thought and I really hoped that it would hold up better, and unfortunately it didn't. So that's what I can take away from it. Hopefully it's helpful. If you have some knowledge to drop, if I've done something wrong, if I've misspoken, throw it in the commentary down below. I'd be interested to hear it. Special thanks to sword friend Matt for sending this sword my way and donating this very expensive thing to learn for posterity's sake, right? To further the knowledge around how well does it hold up in these particular scenarios. This was not an inexpensive thing, and his donation is appreciated. Plus, I have this cool orc-looking chopper thing left. And if you want me to chop this into something, if it would be helpful to learn more, let me know. If you want me to smack it into the brass bit, tell you how it holds up there, I'm happy to do a some sort of follow-up video. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully it's been interesting. Cheers, and thanks for watching.